Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I'm going to be looking at Jane Austen's beautiful Persuasion, and this is part 2. So I spoke in a previous video about the same scene that I'm going to be looking at today, and I spoke about Anne's self-persuasion and her the dual interior voice in the scene, which is Anne's reasonings in dialogue with her feelings. Today, I'm going to be looking at the same scene in Persuasion, the moment when Wentworth says about Anne Elliot that she is so altered that he should not have known her again. But I'm going to be looking at the free indirect discourse within a particular section of this scene. Free indirect discourse, of course, is one of the ways in which Austen was an innovator as a novelistic stylist, but I want to show you how sort of beautifully fluid it is in this scene and how much Austen leaves up to readers to decide various different ideas about perspective. It's one of the ways that Austen is a most remarkable novelist, is to how much space she leaves for readers to make decisions. Austen often does this where it's left flexible, it's left fluid, and there's a lot of space for readers to think about how they're responding to it. And Austen said famously when Pride and Prejudice was first published and she was writing to her sister Cassandra about it, and she says, "I do not write for such dull elves as have not a great deal of ingenuity themselves." And we have to take our genius, our ingenuity, to interpreting Austen's narrative. I'm not going to go into detail about free and direct discourse and explain it much today. If you want more detail about what free and direct discourse is and the way that Austen uses it, then you can have a look at my other video where I describe what free and direct discourse actually is in a bit more detail, and that's in relation to Sense and Sensibility. But suffice it to say for today that free and direct discourse is when the narrative perspective moves into and out of the mind of a character within the novel. Today, obviously, into the mind and out of the mind of the main heroine, Anne Elliot. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel, do please subscribe, hit the thumbs up, it really does help me out in YouTube's algorithm, and I love to hear your comments, so do please comment below if you have any thoughts or responses to what I'm saying here today. So let's get into the scene then. Anne had this spontaneous information from Mary. "Captain Wentworth is not very gallant by you, Anne, though he was so attentive to me. Henrietta asked him what he thought of you when they went away, and he said you were so altered he should not have known you again." So I want to look at the fallout from these words of Wentworth's. What's important to note is that we start with Anne, altered beyond his knowledge. This is Anne's reworking of Wentworth's words. We then go through the passage and we end with the narrative voice saying, "Her power with him was gone forever." So we start with Anne and we end with Wentworth. As I read through it, I want you to, in terms of free indirect discourse, so moving into the mind, into the character, I want you to determine when the transition comes from Anne's mind into Wentworth's mind. When is the transition? When does the perspective shift from Anne's perspective into Wentworth's perspective? So as I read through it, think about where this shift happens. Altered beyond his knowledge, and fully submitted in silent, deep mortification. Doubtless it was so, and she could take no revenge, for he was not altered, or not for the worse. She had already acknowledged it to herself, and she could not think differently. Let him think of her as he would. No, the years which had destroyed her youth and bloom had only given him a more glowing, manly, open look. In no respect lessening his personal advantages, she had seen the same Frederick Wentworth. so altered that he should not have known her again. These were words which could not but dwell with her. Yet she soon began to rejoice that she had heard them. They were of sobering tendency, they allayed agitation, they composed, and consequently must make her happier. Frederick Wentworth had used such words, or something like them, but without an idea that they would be carried round to her. He had thought her wretchedly altered, and in the first moment of appeal had spoken as he felt. He had not forgiven Anne Elliot. She had used him ill, deserted and disappointed him, and worse, she had shown a feebleness of character in doing so, which his own decided, confident temper could not endure. She had given him up to oblige others. It had been the effect of over-persuasion. It had been weakness and timidity. He had been most warmly attached to her, and had never seen a woman since whom he thought her equal. But, except from some natural sensation of curiosity, he had no desire of meeting her again. Her power with him was gone forever. So, when do you think the shift happened? When do you think we moved from Anne's perspective into Wentworth's? Now, it's often said that the shift comes at his name. Frederick Wentworth had used such words, and that this is a kind of abrupt shift from Anne's perspective into Wentworth's. Where Frederick Wentworth had used such words or something like them, but without an idea that they would be carried round to her, and that this is the narrative voice sort of reporting the facts to us. That yes, he had said this, he didn't know that they were going to get round to Anne. He had thought her wretchedly altered, and in the first moment of appeal had spoken as he felt. Again, this is the narrative voice reporting Wentworth's feelings and thoughts to us. He had not forgiven Anne Elliot. She had used him ill, deserted and disappointed him, and worse, she had shown a feebleness of character in doing so, which his own decided, confident temper could not endure. Again, this is narrative voice reporting to us the way that Captain Wentworth felt. She had given him up to oblige others. It had been the effect of over-persuasion. It had been weakness and timidity. So here we move from being told he had thought this into being given his thoughts and presented to them as whole sentences. She had given him up to oblige others. So that we move from the narrative voice reporting what Wentworth thought and felt into seeing those thoughts and feelings. And this is a perfectly reasonable interpretation of the text here. So that's one way that you could read it. But what about instead, if instead of Frederick Wentworth denoting a shift in perspective from Anne's to Wentworth's, what if that Frederick Wentworth is a repetition of Anne's thinking from earlier? So you'll notice at the end of the first paragraph there, she had seen the same Frederick Wentworth. She uses his full name in her thinking. So let's just take that, and instead of thinking that the second Frederick Wentworth is demarcation from Anne to him, we think instead that this is still Anne's thinking about the same Frederick Wentworth. So you could read it then as still being a part of Anne's thinking. And if you read it like that, you might read it slightly differently. So Frederick Wentworth had used such words or something like them, but without an idea that they would be carried round to her. He had thought her wretchedly altered, and in the first moment of appeal had spoken as he felt. So you could read it that this is Anne's reasonings, her thinkings about how Frederick Wentworth had come to say these words. That yes, doubtless it was so, he had used these words, and that he'd said them, but he didn't know that they were going to be brought back to her, confirming her worst thoughts that he did think that she was wretchedly altered, and that this is what he feels about her, that he had not forgiven her. It's interesting, these use of the full names here, because in Anne's thinking, she had seen the same Frederick Wentworth. We see in her mind that she uses their full names when she's thinking. So we could see that she might use her own full name when she is thinking about what others think of her. And in that case, this wouldn't be the narrative voice sort of reporting he had not forgiven Anne Elliot, but it would be Anne's own thinking, her own thinking, because she seems to formulate the two of them using both of their full names. And if you continue on, this is, in this interpretation of free and direct discourse, this is still Anne's thinking about how Wentworth thinks. He had not forgiven her, she had used him ill, deserted and disappointed him, and worse, she had shown a feebleness of character in doing so. So she's confirming her own thoughts about what he thinks about her. In this reading, then, this is Anne's worst fears about what Wentworth thinks of her. That she's feeble, that she used him ill, that she deserted him, that she disappointed him. These are all her worst fears, which seem to have been confirmed because Wentworth has said that she is so altered that he would not have known her, which his own decided, confident temper could not endure. So this interpretation, this is Anne's view of his temper, that he has a decided, confident temper, which stands in contrast to how she sees his view of her character. She had given him up to oblige others. Again, this is her worst fears about what Wentworth thinks. It had been the effect of over-persuasion. That's why Anne is so feeble, because she has allowed herself to be persuaded, to be over-persuaded. It had been weakness and timidity. What you can see this paragraph as then is a continuation of Anne's feelings. It doesn't represent a narrative shift. We aren't now into the mind of Frederick Wentworth. What we're into is we've moved into Anne's response to how she thinks Frederick Wentworth is thinking about her. And what's beautiful is that you can read it either way. You can read it as moving into Wentworth's mind and this being a straightforward representation of how Wentworth has responded to what's happened. Or you can read it, as I have just suggested, as Anne's worries about what Frederick Wentworth thinks about her. But also, of course, it doesn't have to be either or. The whole paragraph you could see as an overlap of both their opinions. It doesn't have to be either it's Wentworth's genuine opinion or it's Anne's worst fears about Wentworth's opinion. What if those are both true? So it is both, yes, what Wentworth thinks, and Anne's own worst fears about what Wentworth thinks. So you can see then this whole paragraph is an overlapping between both their opinions. So what Anne thinks Wentworth thinks, and indeed what Wentworth thinks, which in fact, counter to the contents of the paragraph, actually shows how in sync the two of them are. And just as a small coda in terms of free and direct discourse, we might notice that her power with him was gone forever. Might be Wentworth's thinking, but it's absolutely not true. Her power with him is definitely not gone forever. That's one of the beauties of free and direct discourse, is you go into the mind of a character and into their thinking, even when their self-assessments are wrong and their thinking is utterly wrong. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I hope you found this quick romp through one paragraph an interesting thought experiment in terms of seeing how different perspectives can overlap, and actually that can be more revealing, so that you don't have to say either this is the case or that's the case. Perhaps they're both the case, and perhaps that tells us something even more about how we might interpret the story that's being told to us. Remember, if you like my channel, do please subscribe and hit the thumbs up, and I'd love to know any comments that you have, so do put them in the comments below.